Hello. Whoa, that's gonna be wrong. It's not the password. There we go. Alright. Today we're gonna get back on our project. I know it's been a hot minute and I've missed a bunch of scheduled streams. I was traveling and got caught up in the whole Southwest snafu. So I am back now. For a little while at least. Cool. So today we're going to be making a recipes website. It's still going to be very bare bones, just HTML, but still very exciting. So we're going to go to GitHub. Sign in. Do the thing. And then we'll create a repo called Odin Recipes. So I had made one called Valerie's site to just practice. So I've done a test run of this, but that should mean it goes smoothly today. Fingers crossed. So Odin. Let me see if it's capital or not. Nope. Odin Recipes. Repo for files associated with Odin projects. Recipe project. And it's public. Alright. And we want to add a readme because I believe we're yes. Cool. There we go. I'm just going to copy this. Just the first part of it, because I'm not even going to copy it. SSH, copy. Now we'll go to our terminal, say git. Ooh. This is probably going to close out my Chrome window. I haven't figured out how to do this. We'll just open a new one. Okay. Git clone. Then I'm going to take out some of the extra characters that I don't need. I don't think I need the tilde at the end either. I'm just going to check here and nope, I do not need the tilde, so there we go. Should be done. Now you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to make a directory, but it may have done it for me. Yay! Odin recipes. There we go. There's VS Code. Awesome. Oh, and this is just pulled up our... This is the practice file we had for incorporating images. So this actually just opened up Odin links and images. I'm gonna check out what's actually in this. Yes, I trust the author because that is me. Okay, so that worked a lot better. That worked so much better. So we'll go into our README and set that up. And I'm going to pull the instructions to the side just a little bit so that they are easier to read while doing everything. So in here is our little description that I had made. Just move that over there, if it will move. There we go. So a description on our current project and what skills we will use. So this project will incorporate use of HTML to set up a boilerplate, use of Git to practice adding, committing, also if I spell right, and pushing, as well as using elements of HTML to establish content. Alright, we're going to save. We're going to pull up our terminal, and then while it is on the brain, we're just going to git add. Helps if I do it right. And then we're going to check that it did it. Great. Before I continue, I'm going to add our index file. So index.html. There it is, look at that. Amazing. So they want us to set up the page, which I've just done, and then to put in a H1 header. So I'm going to just title this Odin Recipes before I do that. So that was Odin Recipes, and then here's our H1. I don't need it to be multi-lines. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to git add. And then I will actually do this. edit readme and add text HTML. We're doing things. It's very exciting. Now that we have done that, we are asked to create a new directory. So we will make dir called recipes. It's there, it's beautiful. Now we're in it, and then we need to create a new HTML file called lasagna, or any other recipe that we want it to contain. So what recipe should we use? I'm gonna go simple. I'm gonna do what I had for breakfast this morning, rice and sausage. Dutch rice. That's going to be a pain to write out, so I'm not going to write that. Breakfast one. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to GUI it. Now we're in breakfast one. And gonna do that, and then add our header. Rice and I'll put that in our title as well. I know this is like thrilling for people to watch right now, but it's very exciting. Okay, we've just saved, and then I'm gonna go ahead and git add. What should our message be? Add breakfast one. Yep, that sounds good to me. Then in our index link, we're going to link to our breakfast one page. So we're in our index page, and then I'm in the body. href, and then we'll say recipes. I don't really like to do the dot before. Cool. Tab completion is our friend. Gotta love that. Cool. There's our first link. I'm gonna save it. And then if we wanted to, no, I'm gonna wait to do that. Link to breakfast. Ooh, it says we didn't change anything because we're in the wrong folder. There we go. link to breakfast 1. There we go. Awesome. Cool. So now we have added a recipe page. We've linked it to our home page. It's very, very bare bones. Looks like now we're going to add an image. So we're just going to go to the Google and grab an image, rice and sausage. Image. And then I kind of want one. Okay, that's fine. We'll use this one. So we will do this, and then I am going to, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I'm actually gonna do this in here. Oh, we just want it in here. So, and the name I'm changing to rice and sausage. There we go. And there it is in our Odin recipes folder. And I now need to remember how to add an image. So, image source equals there we go, and there is our image. Let's see if this works. I don't think it did. Alt equals image of rice and sausage. Okay. And S, and then we'll see. Google Chrome, and then we want to open index.html. Okay, so we have our link. That's great. Yay, it did work. We did it right. It's very exciting. First try. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to say boop, and then add photo to breakfast 1. Sweet. Okay, so we have our photo. That was the first requirement. And it just looks tasty. Okay, we have that working now. So we're going to add an unordered list. So we will do UL. And then inside of this unordered list, I'm going to have a header because I want one. Oh, I can do this after. Should probably do that after. Ingredients is our header. So ingredients, and then our list item is going to be our ingredient. So I used sushi rice and just a little plug for field roast sausage. I also used butter and water. There is our unordered list. And now we're going to have another one called steps. So another H2 steps. And then our ordered list, we're going to have there we go. Add 1.5 cups rice and 2 cups water to stovetop pan. Allow to rest. Oh, I'm going to put that in another list item. We're going to have a lot of steps for our recipe. While the rice is resting, lengthwise and widthwise. Heat rice to a boil. Then immediately cover and reduce heat to low for 20 minutes. While rice cooks, heat about a tablespoon butter. taking a while to list all of the recipe steps. Oh, and you can't see what oh, you can. Oh, sorry. I was just looking at the screen layout. My face is right over the terminal. Add sausage, and then once rice is complete, fluff and add sausage. And we'll be cute. We're gonna say enjoy at the very end. Okay, so there is our ordered list. And cool. So that's our iteration 3. I'm gonna save this. And then here in our terminal, we'll say git add. Ooh, that's the wrong command. There we go. Oops. Add ordered and unordered lists. Cool. So great. And then since we have a lot of things in our pipeline, I'm just going to go ahead and push and I used just git push, but I could have also used git push origin main. Both of those work. Iteration 4. So we'll add 2 more recipes with identical page structures to the recipe page we created. And then we'll link from our index page, and then we'll consider putting our links in an ordered list and an unordered list on the index page so that they look nice. And then we'll get to how we share it with people later. But I'm actually going to make an images directory, which means I have to change which means I'll have to change my image source, but it'll make it a little nicer. So I'm going to make directory images, and then actually move our as.jpg to images. Yes. So that does mean that we'll need to go in here to our image source. So ... and then we'll just add images in here. And now this should still work. So I'm gonna save. Cool. We did things. So we're gonna grab another recipe now. Very exciting. We're going to move into our recipes folder. So cd recipes. Then we're going to touch breakfast2.html. Look at it, it's beautiful. And then I'm going to be very lazy. Don't tell anyone. So this recipe, what should we make? another breakfast. So let's make pancakes. Okay, so now we'll need to find another recipe photo. Whoa, those are so fluffy. Oh my goodness. Okay. I might see about making some of those. Okay. Save image as, and then we're going to go into our images directory and save this as images. It's not download. I'm going to call this pancakes. Save. There it is, beautiful in all of its glory, and then we are going to move this and say pancakes instead. With our tab completion, it makes it super easy. I love it. Not having to write out every single character. It's great. Image of fluffy pancakes. So I'm actually going to click the link especially since this page is like just for me. I am comfortable doing this way. So flour, we're going to need flour. And then we're going to need baking powder. And milk. That's a lot of milk. 4 cups of milk. I guess we'll probably be like whisking it a lot. 3/4 cup melted butter. 3 egg yolks. 4 egg whites. And then sweet syrup. Ideally maple. Cool. Now for our steps, I'm just going to delete this previous list because all the steps are going to be pretty long. But whisk dry ingredients in large bowl. Make it well in the center, add the wet ingredients, and then mix. Mix. put ingredients together, then incorporate into dry ingredients. In second bowl, whisk egg whites to soft peaks. Which, has anyone done that? Because it's a lot of fun, but it's very painful. Add beaten egg whites and fold to incorporate. Heat a non-stick pan. Cook 1.5 cups of batter. Covered. Cool. Oh wow, these take a long time. That's good to know. So we're going to cook each one with the lid covering for about 20 minutes. They may be fluffy and beautiful, but they take a long time. So 20 minutes, repeat with remaining batter. Serve with butter and syrup. Syrup. That's not how you spell syrup. There we go. Of your choice. Cool. I'm gonna exit out of this because we have our ingredients and our list. And we're going to git add. Great. Awesome. So we added, committed, and then I just pushed. So we have everything up and live. If I look in my repo, I should now have our directories, our index.html, and if I open that, if I click on that link, then I can see materials here. Woohoo! I like that Git shows you what languages it's incorporating. It's like, this is 100% HTML. There's nothing fancy going on here. So we still need to link back to our pancakes page. So I'm going to change this to an unordered list, like they suggest. Ugh, the tab completion. It gets me every time. I love it. It's so useful. Okay. Because then I can go to the end here and just do that. And it completes it for me. I am spoiled, truly. So href is going to be equal to recipes breakfast 2.html. And then we're going to call that one fluffy pancakes. Great. Awesome. So let's do one more real quick. We're going to add what recipe should we add? I actually feel okay with that. I think I may just leave it at that. I know we're supposed to add a third one, but my creative juices are not flowing. So I'm going to just call this add link to breakfast 2. Huzzah! Have done. So now it's going to talk a little bit about how we view this, what we've just made. We'll go into so we need to make sure that our HTML project has a file called index.html, which basically every web page should have. Go to your GitHub repo and click on settings button. So we're going to go to settings, and then we'll click on the pages sidebar. So pages, there we go. And then we'll change branch from none to main branch. None to main. Yes. And then it'll take a few minutes. Odin project is saying that it takes a while, but last time I did this, it did it pretty immediately. So oh, it's not doing it immediately, but that's totally fine. But once that finishes and our branch is available, then we'll be able to share it with people. Before we do that, though, we'll move on to some CSS. So I'm going to mark this as complete. I know that we did not add a third recipe, so I'm averaging maybe a C on that particular exercise, but I have made a similar repo that has three full pages instead of just 2, so feeling confident on actually being able to sorry, I got distracted. Okay, I'm going to exit out of our VS Code. And we're starting on CSS. Finally, we can start to make things look not just like long lists. Very exciting stuff. So in the previous lesson, you learned how to write HTML, which determines how a web page is structured. The next step is to make that structure look good with some style. And if you remember, CSS stands for Cascade Style Sheet. Cascadian? Cascade. I'm not remembering. So in this lesson, we will add style to HTML with CSS, understand how to use class and ID attributes, add styles and specific elements to correct selectors, and then understand what the cascade does. So it is cascade. So basic syntax. So at the most basic level, CSS is made up of rules. These rules are made up of a selector and a semicolon separated list of declarations, with each of these declarations being made up of property value pair. So a note here is that a div is one of the basic HTML elements. It's simply an empty container. In general, it's best to use other tags like h1 or p for like paragraph for content in your projects, but we'll learn more about CSS. You'll learn that there are cases where all you need is a container for other elements. Many of our exercises use... Why is this telling me this? I don't need to know that. That's great. Thank you. Many of our exercises use plain divs for simplicity. Later lessons will go into much more depth about when it is appropriate to use the various HTML elements. So selectors simply refer to HTML elements which the CSS rules apply. They're what is actually being selected for each rule. So the following subsections don't cover every selector available, but they're by far the most common ones, and you should get comfortable using these first. So I have my little notepad, my legal pad, and I'm going to make an CSS section. So CSS with a big square around it. So our selectors that we will use, they refer to the HTML elements which the CSS applies to. I think I've already read this. I'm so sorry. Our universal selector will select elements of any type, hence the name universal, and the syntax is a simple asterisk, so all. In the example below, every element would have the color purple style applied to it. So I'm going to write down universal, and then that is asterisk. Okay. Next is type selector. I guess I'll write down color as well, because that's good information to have. So color. Then type selector will select all elements of the given element type. So in this example, it is a div. So the color white would be applied to divs hello world and hello again, and then okay bye, but not the paragraph. So type selector, element name. No brackets. Cool, and then class selectors will select all elements within a given class, which is an attribute you place on an HTML element. Here's how you add a class to an HTML tag and select it in HTML. So this would just be within our brackets, the div class equals alert text, and then you could call on that class later. So class selector define a class within HTML element. Call on class in CSS. So note the syntax for class selectors: a period immediately followed by the case-sensitive value of the class attribute. Classes aren't required to be unique, so you can use the same class, on as many elements as you want. Another thing you can do with the class attribute is add multiple classes to a single element as a space-separated list, such as class equals alert text space severe alert. Cool. I'm just going to write down the syntax for that, which is dot class name. Oh, I don't want that there. Awesome! Since white space is used to separate class names like this, you should never use spaces for multi-word names and should use a hyphen instead. Now we move on to ID selectors. So ID selectors are similar to class selectors, and they select, I just want to make sure, is this using my, awesome. I was worried when I hit my headphones that it was using my mic in my headphones and it would have been super loud, but it's not, so great. Instead of period, okay, so we can assign an ID within the HTML element similar to a class type, but instead of calling on it with a dot, we call on an ID with a hash. So you should use IDs sparingly. The major difference between IDs and classes is that an element can only have one ID. An ID cannot be repeated on a single page, and the ID attribute should not contain any white space at all. So sounds like we should use classes more than IDs, but that's good. ID, single use. Define like class. And then we'll call with hash. I'm gonna make this a little wider. Alright. So what if we have two groups of elements that share some of their style declarations? So the class read we have as the color white and the background color of black. And then unread, I guess it's red and unread instead of. The yawns are coming. Uh-oh. So unread has the same style declarations as red. They both share the color white and the background color black. Otherwise, have several of their own unique declarations. To cut down on repetition, we can group these two selectors together as a comma-separated list. So we have dot red on one line and then dot unread on another line, and then we have the style declarations underneath that. And then further down, you can separate dot red for its unique declarations and then unread for its unique declarations. That's good to know. Okay. Both of the examples above, with and without grouping, will result in the same thing, but the second example reduces repetition of declarations and makes it easier to add either a color or background color for both classes at once. So that's super helpful. We love a good shortcut. Another way to use selectors is to chain them as a list without any separation. So let's say we had the following HTML, so div with the div class and the p class, and they're different classes. You could so we have two elements with the subsection header that have some sort of unique styles. But what if we only want to apply a separate rule to the element that also has the header class? So we'll be telling the CSS sheet subsection and header instead of just anything with subsection. And you do that by adding another dot and then the second subsection. So what this does is it selects any element that has both subsection and header. Notice there isn't any space between the subsection and header selectors. This syntax basically works for chaining any combination of selectors except for chaining more than one type of selector. This can also be used to chain a class and an ID as shown below. So we have our paragraph has the class subsection and then the ID preview. So you just add a hash instead of a dot to include the ID. In general, you can't chain more than one type selector since an element can't be two different types at once. For example, chaining two type selectors like div and p would give us the selector type div p, which wouldn't work since the selector would try to literally find div p element, which does not exist. And then we have descendant combinator. Combinators allow us to combine multiple selectors differently than either grouping or chaining them, as they show a relationship between the selectors. There are four types of combinators in total, but for now we're going to only show you the descendant combinator. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly or if I sound really silly right now, but we'll just continue to sound a little silly. This is represented in CSS by a single space between selectors. A descendant combinator will only cause elements that match the last selector to be selected if they have an ancestor, parent, grandparent, etc. that matches the previous selector. Oy. I'm gonna have to wrap this fairly soon since the yawns have descended. Ascended? Descended? So something like ancestor child would select an element with a class of child if it had an ancestor with a class of ancestor. Another way to think of this is child will only be selected if it is nested under an ancestor, no matter how deep. So take a look at the example below and see if you can tell which elements would be selected on the CSS role provided. So ancestor and then .contents. So both the div class, both of these would be selected, but then this outside would not be. So our guess was correct. Both B and C would be selected, but D would not be. There's really no limit to how many combinators you can add to a rule, so .1, .2, .3, .4 would totally be valid. This would just select an element that has a case of 4 if it has an ancestor with a case of 3. And if that ancestor has its own ancestor with a class of 2, and so on. You generally want to avoid trying to select elements that need this level of nesting though, as it can get pretty confusing and long, and it can cause issues when it comes to specificity. So, properties to get started with. There are some CSS properties that you're going to be using all the time, or at the very least, more often than not. We're going to introduce you to several of these properties, though it is by no means a complete list. Learning the following properties will simply be good enough to help you get started. The color property sets an element's text color, while background color sets the background color of an element. Both of these properties can accept one of several kinds of values. A common one is a keyword, such as an actual color name like red or a transparent keyword. They also accept hex, RGB, and HSL values, which you may be familiar with if you've ever used Photoshop or a site where you could customize your own profile colors. If any of you have done the Khan Academy HTML and CSS tutorial, they have you use the RGB values for inputting the colors of the style declarations. Take a quick look at CSS legal color values to see how you can adjust the opacity of these colors by adding alpha value. So here is the CSS legal color values. They include hexadecimal colors, and then hexadecimal colors with transparency, RGB colors, RGBA. Okay. So here's a red with just our base red name in hexadecimal. And then you add the number afterwards to include transparency. To add transparency, add 2 additional digits between 00 and FF. So RGB colors are listed as follows. RGBA includes an alpha channel which specifies the opacity of the object. An RGBA color is specified with the RGBA function, which has the following syntax. So RGBA, and then it has 4 inputs instead of 3. That last one being the alpha parameter, which is between 0 and 1, 0 being fully transparent and 1 being fully opaque. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness, and it represents a cylindrical coordinate representation of colors. An HSL color value is specified with the HSL function, which has the following syntax and takes 3 inputs. Hue is a degree on the color wheel from 0 to 360. So 360 is red, 120 is green, 240 is blue. Saturation is a percentage, meaning a shade of gray is 0 and 100% is the full color. Lightness is also a percentage, so 0 is black and 100% is white. And then again, you can add the A at the end, so HSLA, to indicate the opacity or transparency of your color. Then there are the 140 predefined colors in HTML and CSS color specification. A list of all predefined names can be found in our color names reference. Oh, and it's lovely because they have actual examples of the colors, including their name, and then I believe that's their hex number. That's great. Okay, so typography, basics, and text align. I'm just going to write down how we include a color. So we have our selector, curly bracket, and then we have color with our hex. And then we have our RGB, and RHSL. Super exciting. So a font family can be a single value or a comma-separated list of values that determine what font an element uses. Each font will fall into one of 2 categories, either a font family name like Times New Roman, we use quotes to white space between the words, or a generic family name like sans serif. Generally, family names never use quotes. If a browser cannot find or does not support the first font in a list, it will use the next one, then the next one, and so on until it finds a supported and valid font. This is why it's best practice to include a list of values for this property, starting with the font you want to use most and ending with a generic font family as a fallback. So font family, Times New Roman, and then sans serif. Font size will, as the name suggests, set the size of the font. So you can use font size and then the number of pixels, and there's no space between the number of pixels and the px. Font weight affects the boldness of texts, assuming the font supports the specified weight. This value can be a keyword, so font weight bold, or a number between 1 and 1,000, so font weight 700, the equivalence of bold. Usually the numeric values will be in increments of 100 up to 900, though this will depend on the font. Text align will align text horizontally within an element. You can use common keywords you may have come across in word processors for this property. So text align center, Image and height. Images aren't the only elements we can adjust the height and width on, but we want to focus on them specifically in this case. By default, an image height and width will be the same as the actual image's file height and width. If you want to adjust the size of the image without causing it to lose its proportions, you will use a value of auto for the height and adjust the width value. For example, if an original size was 500 pixels height and 1000 width, using the above would result in a height of 250. So I might actually do that. I have a side project where I have a picture that is way too large and I would like to downsize it. It's best to include both of these properties for image elements even if you don't plan on adjusting the values from the image's original ones. When these values aren't included, if an image takes longer to load than the rest of the page contents, the image won't take up any space on the page at first, but will suddenly cause a dramatic shift on the other page contents once it does load in. I have definitely seen this on some blogs. Explicitly stating a height and width prevents this from happening, as space will be reserved on the page and will just appear blank until the image loads. So the cascade of CSS. Sometimes we may have rules that conflict with one another and we end up with some unexpected results. But I wanted these paragraphs to be blue. Why are they red like the other paragraphs? As frustrating as this can be, it's important to understand that CSS doesn't just do things against our wishes. CSS only does what we tell it to. One exception to this is the default styles that are provided by a browser. So these default styles vary from browser to browser, and they are why elements create a large gap between themselves and other elements, or why buttons look the way they do, despite us not writing any CSS rules to style them that way. If you end up with some unexpected behavior like this, it's either because of these default styles or due to not understanding how a property works, or not understanding this little thing called cascade. The cascade is what determines which rules actually get applied to our HTML. There are different factors that Cascade uses to determine this, 3 of which we'll go over hopefully to help you avoid those frustrating I hate CSS moments. Specificity. A CSS declaration that is more specific will take precedent over those less specific ones. Inline styles, which we will go over more in the adding CSS to HTML section towards the end of the lesson, have the highest specificity compared to selectors. While each type of selector has its own specificity level that contributes to how specific a declaration is, other selectors contribute to specificity, but we're focusing only on the ones mentioned in this lesson. So ID selectors, class selectors, and type selectors. Specificity will only be taken into account when an element has multiple conflicting declarations targeting it, sort of like a tiebreaker. An ID selector will always beat any number of class selectors. A class selectors will always beat any number of type selectors, and a type selector will always beat any number of less specific selectors. When no declaration has a selector with a higher specificity, a larger amount of a single selector will beat a smaller amount of that same selector. Okay, let's take a look at a few examples to visualize how specificity works. Consider the following HTML and CSS code. So we have div class main, and then div class list subsection nested within it. So we have subsection will be blue, and then main and list will be red. In the example above, both rules are using only class selectors, But rule 2 is more specific because it is using more class selectors, so the color red declaration would take precedent. Now let's change things a bit. If we change that subsection class to an ID, now the subsection will be blue because the ID is more specific. Here is subsection .list. The background color is yellow and the text color is blue versus the subsection main list where the color would be red. So the background color would remain yellow, but because there are more class selectors, the color would be red instead of blue. Which is exactly what happens. So rule 2 has a higher specificity. When comparing selectors, you may come across special symbols for the universal selector asterisk, as well as combinators, plus, tilde, and then the greater than, or an empty space. These symbols do not add any specificity in and of themselves. Here, both Rule 1 and Rule 2 have the same specificity. Rule 1 uses a chaining selector, no space, and Rule 2 uses a descendant combinator and the empty space. Both rules have two classes, and the combinator symbol itself does not add to the specificity. Cool. This example shows the same thing, even though Rule 2 is using a child combinator, the greater than symbol. This does not change the specificity value. Both rules have two classes and so have the same specificity values. Alright, and this example, Rule 2 has greater specificity, and the orange value would take precedent over the element because it's using H1 instead of the all. Alright, inheritance. Inheritance refers to certain CSS properties that, when applied to an element, are inherited by that element's descendants, even if we don't explicitly write a rule for those descendants. Typography-based properties, color, font size, font family, are usually inherited, while most other properties aren't. The exception to this is when directly targeting an element, as this always beats inheritance. So parent and then child. So the parent would be red and the child would be blue. Rule order. The final factor at the end of the line, the tiebreaker of the tiebreaker. Let's say that after every other factor has been taken into account, there are still multiple conflicting rules targeting an element. How does Cascade determine which rule to apply? Really simple, actually. It's whichever was last defined. So if we have dot warning and dot alert was written first and warning was written second, so the color will be yellow instead of red. So for, yeah. Okay, adding CSS to HTML. We went over quite a bit so far. The only thing left to go over now is how to add all of this CSS to our HTML. There are three methods to do so. We can use external CSS. It's the most common method you will come across, and it involves creating a separate file for the CSS and linking to it inside of HTML's opening and closing head tags with a self-closing link element as follows. So in our head element, there would be link style sheet hrefstyles.css. And then you would have this information in your style.css file for a reference. First, we add self-closing link elements inside of the opening and closing head tags of the HTML file. The href attribute is the location of the CSS file, either an absolute URL or what you'll be utilizing, a URL relative to the location of the HTML file. In our example above, we are assuming both files are located in the same directory. The rel attribute is required. Excuse me. I'm going to take a sip of water. Okay. The rel attribute is required, and it specifies the relationship between the HTML file and the linked file. Then inside of the newly created styles CSS file, we have the selector, the div, and p followed by a pair of opening and closing curly brackets, which creates a declaration block. Finally, we place any declarations inside of the declaration block, so color or background color. A note on file names. Styles.css is just what we went with as the file name here. You can name it whatever you like, as long as it ends in CSS. Though style and styles are most commonly used. Similarly, in that Khan Academy tutorial, .css is what was used. Internal CSS. I skipped some things. A couple of pros to this method are it keeps our HTML and CSS separated, which results in the HTML file being smaller and making things look cleaner, and we only need to edit the CSS in one place, which is especially handy for websites with many pages that all share similar styles. That is very nice. Internal, or embedded CSS, involves adding CSS within the HTML file instead of creating a completely separate file. With the internal method, you place all the rules inside of a pair of opening and closing style tags, which are then placed inside the opening and closing head tags of your HTML file. Since the styles are being placed directly inside of your head tags, we no longer need a link element to external method required. That the external method requires. Sorry. Besides these differences, the syntax is exactly the same as the external method, selectors, curly brackets, declarations. This method can be useful for adding unique styles to single page of a website, but it doesn't keep things separate like external method. And depending on how many rules and declarations there are, it can make the HTML file get pretty big. Inline CSS. Inline CSS makes it possible to add style directly to HTML elements, though this method isn't as recommended. The first thing to note is that we don't actually use any selectors here, since the styles are being directly added to the div tag or to the element itself. We have the style equals attribute with its value within the pair of quotation marks being the declarations. If you need to add a unique style for a single element, this method can work just fine. Generally though, this isn't exactly recommended for a recommended way for adding CSS to HTML for a few reasons. It can quickly become pretty messy once you start adding a lot of declarations to single elements, causing your HTML file to become unnecessarily bloated. If you want many elements to have the same style, you would have to copy and paste a bunch into individual elements, causing a lot of unnecessary repetition and bloat. And then any inline CSS will override the other two methods, which can cause unexpected results. We won't dive into this, but this can be taken advantage of. Alright, assignment. So there is a CSS exercise repository. Read the README and only do the exercises in the Foundations directory in the order they're listed, starting with the 01 CSS methods and ending with 06 Cascade Fix. Remember the recipes page we created? It's looking pretty plain. Let's fix that by adding some CSS to it. how we style it is completely open, but we should use the external CSS method for the practice and moving forward. You should also try to use several properties mentioned in the section above: color, background color, typography properties, etc. Take some time to play around with the various properties and get a feel for what they do. For now, don't worry about making it look good. It's just to practice and get used to writing CSS, not to make something to show off on your resume. So feel free to go a little crazy for now. Rainbows. We haven't covered how to use a custom font for the font family property, so for now, take a look at CSS fonts for a list of generic font families and use CSS web safe fonts for a list of fonts that are web safe. This means they are installed on basically every computer or device, but still be sure to use a family font or font family as fallback. Knowledge check. So what are the differences between external, internal, and inline CSS? External is a separate file sheet. Internal is listed in the HTML file, and then inline is actually within the HTML element. What is the syntax for class and ID selectors? So class is dot, so it would be dot class, and then an ID is a hash, so it would be hash identification or identifier. How would you apply a single rule to two different selectors? So you would include both of them. So it would be like dot class 2. Given an element that has an ID of title and a class of primary, okay, how would you use both attributes for a single rule? So similarly to how you would apply a single rule for two different selectors, you would do pretty much what I had said. You would have the selector be hash title space dot primary, and then you would have your curly brackets and whatever rule was within that. So for this question up here, if you wanted it to be two different selectors that were not for the same element, you would just line break, but you would still include both of them, and they would be comma separated. So it would be like dot 2 comma dot different comma kind of a thing. Then what does this descendant combinator do? I talked a lot about that, and my brain is just not pulling it together. Between a rule that uses one class selector and a rule that has 3 type selectors, which has higher specificity, I'm going to say the class, because the type is like further out. You like start up at type and then you go down to class and then you go further down to ID. I'm going to click on this. Okay, a descendant combinator will only cause elements that match the last selector to be selected if they also have a parent or an ancestor. Great. Okay. Additional resources. So CSS Cascade is great interactive read that goes into a little more detail about factors that affect what CSS rules how they end up being applied. And then changing the font family describes different approaches used for different fonts. The W3 school, again, they really like the W3 school. It is very informative for sure. Great. Okay, I'm gonna come back to CSS next time. I'm gonna leave it at that for today. So there we are, and then I'm gonna exit that terminal, and Vue course, but it's very exciting. We finished out all of HTML today, and we have moved on to our CSS. We'll do those the exercises associated with that repo we'll do next time, and then we should be able to continue on with our CSS basics, our foundations. Okay.